Is the book of Genesis the history of the entire human race? What if there were people before Adam? What if the flood was not worldwide, but only local? And what if Moses never wrote the books that bear his name? In Europe of the 1600s, anyone asking these questions out loud might have been burned at the stake. Yet, in the 1640s, a French lawyer named Isaac La Peyrère did ask these questions, publicly, in books that he wrote no less, books that immediately unleashed a flood of hostile refutations and sermons. Nobody, not his fellow Protestants, not Catholics, not Jews, nobody agreed with any of his claims. They were all vehemently dismissed as completely nonsensical, heretical, and dangerous. But somehow, La Peyrère managed not only not to be burned at the stake, but instead to be warmly greeted by the Pope, to live out his days in a community of the Oratorian order, despite the fact that he'd cracked open a door that his more famous contemporaries, Thomas Hobbes, Baruch Spinoza, Richard Simon, and others, would later kick wide open. Today, we'll explore how Isaac La Peyrére's radical ideas began the process of turning the Holy Bible into just another book. My name is Alex, and welcome to Depth History, where we talk about how the human condition created and creates the human condition. Isaac La Peyrère was born in the French port of Bordeaux around 1596 into a well-to-do French Protestant family. He trained as a lawyer, and in 1640 he became the librarian of the Prince of Condé, a cousin of King Louis XIV, which gained him access to the Republic of Letters, the pan-European network of scientists, scholars, and diplomats who exchanged books and ideas. La Peyrère traveled across Europe on Condé's behalf, meeting ambassadors, royalty, and intellectuals. In Denmark, he wrote ethnographic accounts of Greenland and Iceland, becoming an acknowledged expert on those remote islands, which, by the way, he never visited. In Brussels, he lived next door to Queen Christina of Sweden, who had abdicated her throne and was in the process of converting to Catholicism. She read the manuscript of his book and was so fascinated by it that she offered to pay for it to be printed. In Paris, La Peyrère showed his manuscript to Father Marin Mersenne, head of the informal Parisian Academy, who showed it to Hugo Grotius, the Dutch humanist theologian who published the first refutation in 1643, even before the book was published, because he considered La Peyrére's theories to be a dangerous threat to the Christian religion. By La Peyrére's time, the medieval worldview had begun to crumble, after a number of unexpected, disruptive events had occurred, events that called into question the picture of the earth as the center of the universe and of mankind as the jewel and purpose of God's creation. The Protestant Reformation and the brutally destructive religious wars, with their hundreds of thousands of victims, shattered the religious unity of European Christendom. In place of a single comforting religious truth, there was now only confusion and anxiety about salvation, because no one could be absolutely sure he'd chosen the one true religion. The overthrow of the Ptolemaic picture of a universe with a corruptible earth at its center, orbited by unchanging heavens, inhabited by incorruptible heavenly bodies, was replaced by the Copernican, vastly larger universe, with the sun at the center, and the earth as one planet among many planets. In 1572, the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe proved that the supernova of that year was beyond the moon and not an atmospheric disturbance, meaning that the heavens were not unchanging as the Church had taught. And in 1577, he proved the same for that year's comet. In 1610, the Italian scientist Galileo, using his new telescope, discovered the moons of Jupiter, which proved that not all heavenly bodies orbit the Earth. and the phases of Venus, which proved that Venus orbits the Sun, and sunspots, which again proved that the heavenly bodies were not incorruptible. The voyages of the Age of Discovery, especially the European discovery of the Americas, inhabited by millions of people who lived without the benefit of religion or civilization. The growth of the myth of the all-wise, peaceful, noble savage, and which raised the question of whether those millions were damned simply for being born out of reach of the Christian message. There was also the question of where these natives had come from, since it was clear that they could not be the descendants of Noah. All these events shattered the comforting religious complacency of European Christians and badly damaged the reputations of their churches, and questions which it once had been dangerous to ask could now be asked, but only discreetly. La Peyrére's heresy was a mixture of three theories: the imminent arrival of the Messianic age and the recall of the Jews, the pre-Adamite theory that there were people before Adam, and the true authorship of the Bible. In 1643, La Peyrère published his first theory in a pamphlet entitled Du Rappel des Juifs, on the recall of the Jews, in which he argued that the Messiah's arrival was imminent, that the Jews would be converted to a sort of watered-down Christianity, and, under the leadership of the King of France, would return to the Holy Land and rebuild Zion. 12 years later, in 1655, La Peyrère published the second of his theories, Pré-Adamité, Men Before Adam, in Amsterdam. It was something of a bestseller. 4 editions were published that same year, and it was quickly translated into the vernacular languages. In the book, La Peyrère claimed that the Bible was not the history of the world, of humanity as a whole, but the history of only the Jews, that when God created Adam, there were already other people in the world, Gentiles, people he called pre-Adamites, people whom God had created long before. So Adam was the ancestor of only the Jews. He also claimed that the Garden of Eden story applied only to the Jews, that Noah's flood was local and affected only the Jews, and that Moses had not written the entire Bible, but only parts of it. In support of his ideas, he asked, who was Cain's wife, the mother of his child? The Bible doesn't mention any women alive at that time except Eve. Why did Cain say that he feared that anyone who sees me will kill me, if the only other people in the world were his parents? For whom did he found the city, if there were so few people in the world? And how could Moses have written about his own death? How could he have spoken of beyond the Jordan when he'd never crossed it? What about all the contradictions? 2 different versions of the creation story, 2 different versions of the spy story, the list of Edomite kings who ruled long after Moses died, and many more anomalies. And more important, no matter who had actually written the Bible, its text had surely been corrupted over the centuries by countless scribes making flawed copies of flawed copies of flawed copies. Even if Scripture was originally divinely inspired and holy, no perfectly accurate copy of it exists today. The Bible, he concluded, is a book like any other book, and it should be studied as such. La Peyrère was not the first or the only person to express doubts about these topics, but he was the first to take these doubts to the extreme, and the reaction was swift. Almost immediately, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish authorities unanimously condemned his books. He was accused of being a heretic, an atheist, or crypto-Jew. His books were banned and burned everywhere, and a flood of books and pamphlets rejecting his theories rolled off the European presses. As more and more condemnations and refutations appeared, La Peyrère, who was shocked by the universal condemnation of his ideas, went to Brussels to try to get Condé to protect him. However, one day in February 1656, 30 armed men entered his room and carried him off to jail. There, as he was interrogated over and over again, he felt that he'd been abandoned by Protestants and even by his prince. At first, he refused to retract his views, but after 6 months, it was quietly suggested to him that if he repented, apologized to the Pope, and became a Catholic, he would be forgiven. So, seeing no other solution, he agreed and set off for Rome. In January of 1657, he met Pope Alexander VII, who smiled at him and said, "Let us embrace this man who is before Adam." La Peyrère later described his audience with the Pope to the Dutch scientist Christian Huygens. The general of the Jesuit order had told La Peyrère that both he and the Pope had laughed delightedly when they read his book. Maybe this is what saved him. It was said of him that gentleness, simplicity, and tolerance formed the basis of his character. Maybe he was so mild-mannered, so charming, and his theories were considered so crazy that people just couldn't take this harmless, eccentric old man too seriously. La Peyrère then wrote an apology and a not entirely sincere recantation, in which he said he'd been led astray by his Calvinist upbringing. Though he could find no scriptural evidence against his theories, he now renounced them because the Pope had told him they were wrong. La Peyrère was duly forgiven. He returned to Paris and lived quietly as a lay member of the Oratorian order, still serving as Condé's librarian until his death in 1676. He never actually gave up his theories. Richard Simon, his fellow Oratorian, said he was constantly discussing his ideas with anyone who would listen, and Peter Bale wrote that he was always writing books that would be burned as soon as the good man died. At the time, many theologians interpreted the chaos of the Reformation as a sign of the imminent fulfillment of the prophecies in the books of Daniel and Revelation, especially concerning the recall and conversion of the Jews and the arrival of the Messianic age. So La Peyrère's ideas fit right in with the atmosphere of the times. For example, the 16th century French Orientalist, philosopher, and Christian Kabbalist William Postel, who had been thrown out of the Jesuits and been imprisoned by the Inquisition, Postel had also predicted the imminent coming of the Messiah, and that the King of France would unify Christianity and restore the converted Jews to the Holy Land. As for the pre-Adamite theory, it was a response to questions raised by the discovery that China and India had written traditions that went back much further than the 6,000 years since the biblical creation, long before the time of Adam and Eve. The discovery of the previously unknown and unimagined people of the Americas. How had they gotten there from Noah's Ark? The pre-Adamite theory was the obvious answer, a separate creation. They were not descended from Adam and Eve. As for the questions La Peyrère raised about the Bible, he was not the first. The 11th century Rabbi Abraham ben Ezra had already asked many of the same questions, but had left them unanswered, writing that the wise should stay silent about them. In 1516, the well-respected Dutch Christian humanist and Catholic priest Desiderius Erasmus published an edition of the New Testament in Greek, which did not include the Johannine Comma, the text in the first epistle of John, which is the only scriptural reference to the Trinity, because it didn't appear in the Greek manuscripts he'd consulted. In response to the intense furor the omission produced, he inserted the Johannine Comma in his later editions by translating it back from the Vulgate. Isaac La Peyrère died in Paris in 1676. His epitaph read, "Here lies La Peyrère, that good Israelite, Huguenot, Catholic, and finally pre-Adamite. 4 religions pleased him at the same time, and his indifference was so uncommon that after 80 years, when he had to make a choice, the good man left and did not choose any of them." La Peyrère was not the first to raise the questions he did, but he was the first to publicly take those doubts to such openly heretical conclusions, and despite all the refutations, his ideas did not disappear. They survived in the works of Baruch Spinoza, Richard Simon, Thomas Hobbes, Voltaire, and others. They fed into modern historical criticism and even mutated into racist theories. The story of Isaac La Peyrère is a reminder that even an outlandish idea can have far-reaching effects. Reading the Bible as La Peyrère read it helps us understand how it became, in the eyes of many, just another book. If you'd like to support the channel, why not buy me a coffee at the link below? If you enjoyed this video, please click the like icon, share the video, subscribe, and ring the bell so that you'll be notified of new videos as soon as they come out. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.